Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Latin American Studies virtual lecture series. This is our Friday seminar. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, director of the center at Stanford University. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, Giovanna Pineda, I want to mention a couple of things having to do with the Zoom webinar format. So all attendees are in listen-only mode. Only the speakers will be able to share videos. If you run into any technical difficulties or you have a question, please reach out through the chat function in Zoom. The lecture is also being recorded and live streamed through the class YouTube webpage. So those who wish also to participate in the Q&A session should join the webinar. The link to join will appear when you have registered, and the Q&A session will not be actually live streamed on the YouTube channel. All webinar attendees are muted throughout the webinar, but you can send questions to the Q&A question throughout, and we will make sure that Dr. Giovanna Pineda can address them. I also want to acknowledge that here at Stanford, we are in the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude to the land, to the water, to the air that surrounds us, and we pay our respect to the past, the present, and the future Ohlone and Lenape peoples who continue today in their quest to retain their homelands and to be present throughout their diasporas. I want to remind you all that the Native American communities throughout the United States are suffering quite substantially, disproportionately from the COVID epidemic. So if you can support indigenous organizations in any way you find fit, with your time, with money, or even just learning and encouraging others to learn about them, I really encourage you to do so. So thank you for joining us in this lecture via Zoom and YouTube. Our guest today is Dr. Giovanna Pineda. The title of her talk is Caudillo, Machine Culture, the Rise of Machine Culture in Rural Argentina, 19th Century. Dr. Pineda is a truly impressive scholar. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida. She is the author of the book Industrial Development in a Frontier Economy, the Industrialization of Argentina, 1890-1930, published in Stanford University Press. She has an upcoming book called The Sensational Machine, Technique Culture in Argentina, which examines the ritual and the myth-making in the design, the maintenance, and the repair of harvesters and tractors, drawing from ethnographic methods, archival resources, oral histories, rumor, social media, material culture. It is a truly interdisciplinary work that charts the genealogy of technological culture in Argentina throughout a 200-year period of development of people's emotional and sensory meanings of this cutting-edge technology. I must mention also Dr. Pineda also is in charge of an incredible resource that I want to everyone take a time, if you can, after the talk, to spend some time there, which is the virtual reality Middle Passage experience. You can find that in her website. It is a truly remarkable thing that uses some of her skills as a documentarian, as a filmmaker, in which she, creates a vivid experience of the slave trade from Africa to the Americas. So I really want to encourage people to take a look at that, although she will not talk about that in today's session. So Giovanna, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you, Alberto. You're very kind. All right, and thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. So what I'm presenting today is actually very new. So it's chapter 1 of my book, which I'm in the process of writing right now. So I stopped research around COVID. Otherwise, maybe COVID sort of saved the project, because otherwise I would have kept looking for stuff. Partly is, as you'll find out in this project, a lot of it had to do with my field work and meeting a lot of people in the countryside and trying to understand machinery. And when I, just for especially grad students are here, I first came into the project thinking, oh, I'm going to do another economic history of machinery in the countryside. And I started, as any good economist does is I started on the urban side and reading a lot of everything that I could about the urban tropes and getting a lot of statistical material, collecting a lot. But if I had done just that, I would have just come up with the same repetitive story that a lot of people hear. It's not as developed. The machinery, there is machinery there, but it's not at the same level. You know, the idea is that it's not at the same level as like Europe or United States or something. So that stuff is still there. It's still there in the chapter, but it plays a much smaller role. Because what I discovered was that these people were absolutely fascinating because farm machining culture, it's like they had created their own culture and identity around farm machinery, and just the level of just spirit in them and just the spirit in the ways that they thought about machinery was so different than any way that I could have ever thought. And the field work, as I'm talking about today, a lot of it had to do with being in the countryside for going back between like teaching and then going into the summers and whenever I could. So over the course of 3 years. And then social media is used as well in this because as I met more people learned of me, because I also became a trope. Here I am in the South America, in the middle of, look at these things, in the medio de la nada, in the middle of like the countryside area, a lot of the times at bus stops or truck stops, just interviewing people, but just word of mouth, people found out about me, and I got people contacting me through Messenger, WhatsApp, to give me more information, pictures and films, music, poetry. So that's how over time I discovered like, wow, this is an entire trope of the machine. And like I hadn't read about that yet, because everything that when I was on the urban side, reading about the countryside had more to do with topics that you probably heard about, like the Gaucho and the Caudillo. So the Gaucho and Caudillo, I'm not going to ignore them. They're still there. They're an important trope. But also the story of the machine, not just the machine as a thing of development, but also the machine as a part of culture. And I think I hadn't seen anything of that nature yet. So I'm like, that's what also intrigued me into writing about it as well, and learning a lot from the people that I talked to. So I'll begin. I begin first. I apologize for reading my paper initially, but I just wanted to make sure to get all these ideas very clear. And then I'll go into the PowerPoint here, but I guess I can put it up right now. Here, okay. All right, so see this for like a little bit here. Are part of historical concepts and texts. Oops, don't send. Oops. Did I get cut off?
No, we only have a black screen, Joanna. We don't have any slides yet. We see the PowerPoint that should come up, but only get a black screen.
Okay, I got cut off. I'm back again. Okay. All right, so let me try again to share screen. Can share. Okay. Okay, can you see the screen now? Yes, okay. Yes, okay, good, thank you. All right, so narrative discourses are part of historical concepts and combining fact, fiction, and legend. In this presentation for today, Caudillo Machine Culture, I explored the transformative impact of farm machinery through an analysis of different cultural narratives and tropes about the Argentine Pampas. These narratives are in literature, historical works, oral histories, and material culture, and often appear across time and space in nonlinear and non-chronological fashion. Some of these narratives are well known to readers of Argentine rural history. For one, the urban intellectuals who invented the 20th century Gaucho trope to evoke nostalgia and to criticize modernity. A second one is the political elite who created a narrative focused on progress, including transforming and destroying the countryside and what they thought were backward ways through the introduction of rural science, machinery, and technology. Other narratives came from the practical-minded technocrats who focused on writing manuals and guides to operate small and large farms. Small farm would be a chacra, a larger one, an estancia. And then, of course, also encourage the use of agricultural technology. Now, a lesser known narrative comes from probably the rural towns themselves, the rural folk who tell their stories about technology and the celebration of sedentary life. What's most important there is community life. And one thing that combines all of these stories is all of these narratives use the countryside as their backdrop to the characters who intersect but are separate. They often are similar, yet different. And they support the tropes of masculinity, identity, and life work. Most of this research is a lot comes from my field work in the Argentine countryside. And I will say that only once I heard the actual word gaucho, and it was in reference to the poem Martín Fierro, also known as El Gaucho Martín Fierro, published in 1872. It's a 2,300 line epic poem by the Argentine writer Jose Hernandez. In it, Martín Fierro rebels against a corrupt system, forcing conscription in the military. Inevitably, he escapes and becomes an outlaw. This narrative, or this poem, could be read as one elite to another, debating the Europeanization of the countryside and a critique of it as well. And this poem, what's significant, is also published in 1872. And I think about 9 months after what was known as the Great National Fair of Progress and Identity in Cordoba, which was in 1871. And that fair showcased the aesthetics of modernity, civilization, and progress in Argentina. Now, this was a major spectacle, and it was a whole event. It began in Buenos Aires City, so it really was for the urban folk. And when you boarded the train, traveling on the very new route and the very new trains from the city to the fair in Cordoba. And at the time period, Cordoba was considered el interior, the backward rural side. But one of the things that the president at the time, Domingo Sarmiento, and the organizer of the fair, Eduardo Olivera, wanted to do was to show people the progress that could be done in the interior. So this spectacle was carefully crafted with specific scenes of modernity intended to stimulate adrenaline and evoke the senses, the sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Olivera, who had actually attended the Parisian fairs, international exhibitions, a lot of this was based on models on the international exhibits that had already been done in London and Paris. Olivera, who had actually experienced that, he was the one to organize it. He insisted he should be the one to organize it because he knew how to carefully select the aesthetics to make an impact on everyone. And for him, he held the machine trials where they show how the machines work, of foreign harvesters and reapers from Pittsburgh and Chicago. He showed the results of crop seeds that were grown and harvested in the Kew Gardens in London. And he brought in livestock from Scotland, New Zealand, and Australia. This event, which was manipulated by the ruling elite, celebrated the success of the civilization project that, in most respects, and most literature has said, has repressed, controlled, or convinced allies and enemies that the liberals offered the best solution for attaining progress. So if that's what this event was about, then it was a success. But other urban intellectuals offered an alternative image of the Pampas. And this is where we get the Gaucho image. The Gaucho image that eventually generated a plethora of poems, novels, song lyrics, ephemera, films, and it just keeps going and going through the 19th and 20th centuries. Like historical works, literary genres such as these gauchesque, and I will also call them the progress writings, were created after events took place. Through the textual and visual products of the images of the gaucho against the image of the progress, one group of urban intellectuals were really saying they wanted their nationhood to be imagined through the past of the imagined gaucho. Another focused on words that they used a lot is porvenir, which could be both or future or destiny of the nation. And one of my arguments is who was to say that either side was right or wrong in looking toward the past or the future to find an identity. And one short story that I think really highlighted a lot of this to me was one by Jorge Borges in his short story El Sur, the South, infers to the urban writer-reader that terms such as el interior, el gaucho, el indio, el europeo, or even la civilización existed only in a literary form. The reader need not choose. They could merely enjoy a kaleidoscope of tropes when they read these historical literary works. So one of my challenges then is to find what is going on. Where is this machine? I know these machines are there because as I said earlier, I had collected all the statistics. There's millions of plows and harvesters and reapers coming into the country. So what's the story about them? So drawing on archival materials, fieldwork, literature, foreign and resident traveler accounts, lore, and material culture, I show how these historical cultural narratives captured some of the rural transformations as they happened in fiction and in the imagination in regards to agricultural technology. Over the course of the 19th century, rural people had indeed transformed their ways of thinking about rural economy and social life. Based on oral stories collected from my fieldwork during the 3 years from 2014 to 2017, in the Campos, in pueblos, at bus terminals, or truck stops, in Santa Fe, Entre Rios, and Buenos Aires, I argued that by 1861, according to a lot of locals, the countryside, the farmer or the low or semi-skilled rural worker had already known how to use, repair, and design farm machinery, tools, and other farm technology. In some regions, being a machine owner or someone who made his living from machines, there's a lot of different words in Spanish for this, depending on what exactly you do, became a source of male honor. The division of labor in farm household regarded a newly arrived farm machine or tool intended for commercial crop cultivation as gendered. And the fact that machines were considered gendered male presumably enhanced male identity. So another argument that I make in the work is also that, if we're going to imagine that gauchos actually exist, let's just say it did, perhaps having a machine softened the transition from an alleged nomadic lifestyle of the Argentine rural male to a respected family man and machine owner. So sort of transition there. Overall, within the rural context, farm work was part of a rural identity. In a lot of interviews I interviewed a lot of people who were, the oldest person was 101, and they also talked about their grandfathers. That was one of the popular tropes as well. A lot of people talked about their grandparents and what they remembered from them. But one of the rural identities that they had, the description of how they described the use of machinery to do work and to sell and basically everything they did had a very life work perspective. They consisted of a corporeal and a moral being. By that, I mean that these concepts defined both the physical existence, but they also identified traits that made him, usually him, because the man was the farmer, him a worthy individual. And what made him worthy was decided by the social mores of the community he lived in. Oh, I'm not moving it. Excuse me. Okay. In the rural regions, each town I visited.
Giovanna, sorry to interrupt you, but then we're going to put the spotlight on you since the PowerPoint is not moving so that we can see you more focused on you.
Okay. Like this?
Okay, that's great. Okay. And then we'll see the slides afterwards. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so in the rural regions, each town I visited had created their own narratives in lore and aesthetics about the age of rural technology. So now I need the PowerPoints. Can you see this or not? Let me see. Let me share. Okay. So can you see the PowerPoints now? Yes. Okay. Good. All right. So now I'm moving it.
And you put it on presenter mode, just clicking on the presentation part. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Okay, so what I wanted to show you here is where I actually went. So I'm sure there's other lores and narratives. I'm not in any way claiming like, oh, this is the countryside lore. I'm going to specific regions. Here I did it with the big square here, mostly concentrated in Santa Fe, just because it was so fascinating. It was like, and I had many interviews in this region. Here I circled on the right side, at least my right side, sections here where I was in Paraná, Santa Fe, Esperanza, and then also in Rosario and other parts. But one town that I spent a considerable amount of time on, and a lot of my research is based on San Vicente, Santa Fe. So the town calls itself La Cuna de la Cosechadora, the birthplace of the harvester. And this is a place where they're going to create at one point had like 4 harvester companies. So there's a whole like narrative, which I'll get into in a minute. But I did want to say that each of these rural towns, small towns, bigger towns, they all had created a narrative, a lore, an aesthetic about the age of rural technology. The one thing they all had in common was there was a more or less defined period, the time of this, and then I would look it up, and what was the time of that, and where it ends. And it's usually over a 100-year period of 1860 to 1960. With the climax of the age of the machine in the rural side being in 1960. Why 1960? 1960 is the date of the Festival of the Harvester, when 24 companies at that time period, although someone else tells me there was 39, but so far it was about 24 domestic harvester companies presented themselves at the festival, and President Frondizi at that time period in 1960 arrived to observe the grand festival with all of these harvesters showing off. So according to local lore, the rural classes had already developed their own styles of machine making by 1871, perhaps even earlier, that they continued to evolve through the 19th and 20th century. Now, by the time of the 1895 census in the region, which provided more detail about rural life than any census before that, it showed that one of the primary occupations in Santa Fe after farmer, or in addition to farmer, was some type of machine or iron worker, herrero or forjador. Now, I just wanted to quickly note that I am categorizing a lot of these things. Being out in the countryside, I realized that not everyone, time and space are a little bit different, and not everyone categorizes it. But to simplify things, and because I am an academic, I have to categorize these rural groups. But note that it is a very highly diverse group. And some groups take on different roles, because another thing too that's very common in the countryside was the hustle and the gig. If you can't be a tractor driver one day, well, you got to learn how to be a mechanic or a blacksmith and do something. So it's a very diverse population. But just to give you a sense, I'll just say some of the names that all the new words I learned while I was out there, like estancieros, caudillos, chacareros, herreros, campesinos, peones, changarinis. But there's a lot of different words. And also, depending on what you do within a factory or what exactly you do to a machine, then you become that thing. So you almost embody the machine as well, which I also found very interesting. And it's also part of the life work of how they perceive machinery. Now here, this is an image, start going through the slides and I'll show you what they all mean. As I said before, the trope of the machine in the countryside is perhaps not as well known as, say, the trope of the gaucho, but it is there and people know it. So in this image here, and this was very common, especially people telling me, well, I was asking, well, how did technology begin? And this comes from another artist, but what it is they would always start with the idea of the oxen. When they moved technology from the oxen to the horse, what did they need to do? They needed to figure out the yoke. They needed around the neck of the animal. They needed to find out how to attach the instruments to the hips of the oxen or the horse. So what this is just a quick drawing of, this is oxen, right? How is this, the yoke go around their neck, but then how do you change it and put it around a horse? And the horse technology just makes everything faster, speed up the harvesting and cultivation thing. So that's one of the reasons why you moved from oxen to horse. And also being in the Pampas, there was a considerable amount of horses out there. And here you have the wagon. So another form of technology, aside from animal technology, was the wagon. So here you see a man standing on the wagon, and here you have a horse. Important to converting this wagon into an actual farm machine were things such as how it holds up, who's going to pull it or push it. That's another thing. Also the type of iron that you will use to plow. But all these little details also made me realize that any farm machine, what it really is just a machine with a lot of tiny parts. Because what a farm machine is supposed to do is just replace animal and human labor. So over time, now this picture is from an imagination of the 1850s. So it tells us kind of the process of machine making or technology making. So two things that I'm going to get into is talk a little bit about that 1871 exhibit, the state and the culture, how the state is trying to, state-sponsored culture, essentially, to make people accept that, you know, the countryside is now going to change. But that's in contrast to the rural popular culture, because even though the state at the same time was creating its version of what the countryside should be, rural popular culture was also from below creating its own way of how to incorporate machinery and create a machine culture. So narrative discourses, some of the questions that I look at is, what is the Argentine countryside? It really depends on who is looking at it, whether it's urban intellectual or someone living in the rural side. Who defines it? How is it characterized? The tropes of the countryside. The urban tropes tend to be the gaucho, which represents a past, the porvenir literature, which represents a future, and modernity tends to be present, like what is going on at that moment. Popular rural tropes tend to be more practical and realistic, and they tend, if they're happy, they're about celebrating the sedentary community life or even family life. And farm machinery and technology within the rural trope becomes a significant part. A farm machine, at least within the interviews that I had, become part of the family. They become part of this life work, this how your world is going to be managed. You know, the machine becomes part of all that. So Domingo Sarmiento here and Eduardo Oliveira, the very two famous men. Domingo Sarmiento in particular, he basically influenced an entire generation between 1830s until he was president. A lot of different things. He was basically known for his book, The Civilization and Barbarism, the two contrasts. You can't have both, you have to have one. And of course, he chose on the way of civilization. But he's also a textbook writer. He also developed education. I mean, he had a lot of control over ways of language and knowledge making within towns and cities. And I think he was trying to apply that as well into the countryside. Eduardo Oliveira is an elite ranch from an elite ranching family, and he was also traveled all over Europe trying to learn everything he could about agricultural practices. He actually enrolled in the Grignon Institute of Agronomy. It's one of the first and most famous like Parisian agricultural schools at the time period, not to get a degree in it, just to learn. And also to get like first access to some of the fairs, like the Paris International Agricultural Fairs, because he was learning. He was trying to pick up, okay, what are the aesthetics? What do I need for bringing this back to Argentina? Or at least according to Oliveira's biographies and autobiographies, that's what he intended to do. Now, the National Fair of Progress and Industry in Cordoba. So here are a few images. So it was organized by Oliveira, and you can see some of the fields there. It's done in a fashion to emulate what was already being done in other places, in particular within Europe. Okay. And I have a couple things as well. The other thing too that he talks a lot about, I won't play it now because I'm not sure if it'll work, but it's hopefully they'll share this PowerPoint with you, is the sounds of machinery. So one thing that Oliveira talks a lot about is he wanted everyone to feel the way he did. So when he went to Paris and felt the machine, he talked a lot in his autobiography about the sounds of the machine, just the crunching of the earth. To him, this was all very stimulating. And he wanted to bring that back, including even the taste. This fair started in 1868. So he planted seeds, as I said, from Kew Garden. He wanted to get those flavors and the soil. He wanted to emulate everything that he could to convince everybody that this was the way of the future. Two things here. One is I put this picture of the Gaucho because this one actually is a posed picture. So this Gaucho 1868 is around the same time the President Sarmiento comes into power. And it's a posed picture. I can only tell you, I think it's an actor he doesn't look to me like somebody who has been working the land. His hands are too clean. His face is too handsome. He doesn't look like someone who's been under, a lot of duress his whole life. Yes, he does have the knife and everything and the boots, but typically if you were a true person out in the countryside, you didn't even wear shoes. And I'll show you some examples of that, of people who actually did work the land, some of the pictures from the practical realist side that don't show such a fancy gaucho. So I'm pretty sure this is a posed one, but I've seen it a lot in a lot of different Wikipedias. Um, to the elite, this is what the rural side was to be, something very pompous and big, something that was to them very civilized, but a lot of it was very aesthetic. It was just beauty, right? Visual and sound. Here are some prizes that you would get at the rural fairs. And just to give you kind of an idea also of the transitions in urban areas. So this one here, Sociedad Rural Argentina, this was Eduardo Olivera's club. He founded the club. And it was based out of Buenos Aires, out of the city. If anyone has ever been to it, every year the Sociedad Rural, maybe not this year because of COVID, but in all past years, they've had the rural fair right in the city. And the prize here, and I wanted to compare the two because this is Buenos Aires and here to the right, these are both from the 19th century, is from Rosario, which is a little bit more in the, it's still a city, it's a town, but it's more in the rural side, closer to the rural side. So this one here on the left, both of them have the three muses, both of them representing things that are part of the wealth of the nation. So here the wheat, the fruits, and a little lamb over here, I guess to symbolize also the sheep. And the three muses that have a more of a Greco-Roman look. And as you can see over here on the side, very common Greco-Roman was the laurels that, you know, signified victory and stuff. So this is one concept of an elite, urban elite, imagining again the countryside. Here, the one on the right, just to give you a sense of, this is from the Sociedad Rural para Rosario, who, in this sense, they felt themselves more rural than the urban people or the porteños from Buenos Aires. So this one here, you still have the three women, the three muses, but they're holding different things. They're now holding the cow for cattle. The one here on the far right is holding the sickle, a tool, right? The other one did not have a tool. Like, this is the more realistic here. She has a tool. She has a hand scythe. She's holding the wheat. And then the woman in the middle is holding tools. She's holding the gear, the symbols of machinery, the gears, and also the hammer. And also indicating that this is hard work, like that you're going to do in the countryside. Another thing too that I wanted to point it out is their features are less Greco-Roman and more of the Argentine countrywoman style, with the shorter hair, not finely done, as you can tell, kind of like a little bit messy. So a little bit more realistic, still elite, but a little bit more realistic and closer to the vision of the countryside. Now, one of the things I've noticed, I looked at enough pictures of the countryside. I mean, the gaucho trope just always jumps out and I can't get away from it. So I needed to embrace it instead of just trying to avoid it. And one of the things, definitely, when it is a visual aesthetic of the elite or the urban elite or even urban intellectuals, the gaucho is portrayed in action. The gaucho is the machine from an outsider urban perspective. He's constantly in motion. So you see this, these are actually this one here on the left is from the 1860s, and then the one on the right is from the 1930s. But the themes are the similar, which is the gaucho is working. So on the left side, he's working for the elite, for the other estancieros, the ranch holders, right? Setting up the saddle and stuff, a little bit fancier, but he's still working. And as you can see over here, he's not wearing shoes. So a true gaucho does not, or worker does not have nice leather boots. They're usually barefoot, or they just wrap some wraps around their feet just to keep them protected. And over here on the right, you have a gaucho in motion, but this was done in the 1930s, showing him more in a very active piece, you know, kind of the imagined that, you know, he's still, I guess, trying to tame horses. And most of the images, when they're made from urban intellectuals or people outside of the country, they also tend to be more masculine in the sense that I don't see as many women in them, unless the woman is in some sort of submissive form, such as serving a man or serving him food or somehow tending to chickens. So it's a very masculine world for those who are on the outside. Over time, what I discovered too was the image of the gaucho became a little bit more cartoonish over time. So these are from the 1930s and 40s. The artist is Molino Campos. I know he's beloved by many. They always, in Buenos Aires at least, they always tell me about Molino Campos. It was meant to evoke nostalgia. A lot of his images were actually in the calendar. A Fábrica de Alpargatas is a it's a shoe company, but it's made like I guess what we now call like Toms or something, those type of shoes, like a cloth covered shoe. So before you had tennis shoes, you had Alpargatas. So his images appeared on a lot of these calendars, which actually a lot of farm workers still have, but they just keep it as a sort of thing of nostalgia. So here in the top, you get like the stereotype, the gaucho who goes to the boliche, the bar, and gets drunk and, you know, here in this case, just standing there looking at you. And at the bottom here, I found this one with the woman. Again, as I said, usually in submissive form, you can see to her, or on the image, you can see a man that's just like looking at her while she's working, right? She's feeding chickens. So in a more submissive form. Oops. Okay, oh, and I guess to top it all off, since I am in Orlando, Walt Disney was very interested in the gaucho for whatever reason. 1928, if you guys are interested, you can also see the galloping gaucho. So there was the gaucho Mickey, and every stereotype you can think of about Argentina is in this film. So it was interesting to see, yeah, the gaucho who rides the rias, the gaucho who you know, basically has the bolas and everything. So everything that was perceived, everything that was written about was in this film, in Mickey Gaucho. So now I want to turn to when I started to look at the aesthetics more of, well, what do more country people, what do they think of themselves? I can't, you know, as I said, when I was out in the countryside, nobody mentioned gaucho to me. And I think it would be embarrassing if I had said it. It was only somebody who had mentioned it to me. He was actually driving me. He was a driver, didn't even know me, but decided to drive my family and me throughout different parts of the countryside to talk to different farmers. And he happened to mention the gaucho Martin Fierro. But one of the things that I noticed immediately with the art of people who were just there, this one particular artist, Palier, he did a lot of his art or his illustrations from the 1850s to the 1860s, and then published them in a book. But he was just there to just observe. So he actually just illustrated by hand things that he saw. So here you have the gaucho sentado, right? And one of the things I wanted to point out is he's not trying to tame horses. He's not out of control. He's not a machine. It's just very practical, very realistic, functional. Other themes that I find is family life, a lot about town and community, and also a more sedentary lifestyle. So this one here, you know, he just, you know, paisano or gaucho, whatever you want to call him. He's a country person, just enjoying, sitting, you know, enjoying life, not in any type of motion. Other things too, images that I wanted to point out is, so here the gaucho tocando la guitarra. So he calls him that, but I think in his kind of rendition, he's basically saying the gaucho is a campesino. He's a, you know, he's a rural person. He's a peasant, or but he has a life, you know, he's not always like chasing horses or rias or trying to kill something. So here you have the family life, and you can see everybody's very relaxed. They're enjoying mate. That's the hot water right there. And then I think one of them is drinking the mate. And here he is with his partner, his female partner, another female here, and the clothes hanging from the top. So you can tell that this is just like a family scene of, you know, and people are just relaxing. On the left side is shopping. And again, you see what in urban intellectuals' mind they were calling the gaucho. But here he is with women at a store, just, you know, hanging out, shopping. I will say a lot of these images they're still masculine, but it's a different type of masculinity. And also they include women, because women, of course, are part of also rural culture. A couple more here, just the family en viaje, la familia en viaje. So here you have the countryside family with the children on the horses, and they're just traveling. So for me, this was okay. This is closer to probably the more realistic of how gauchos would live every day, or campesinos. So my research findings then, and I'll start with a couple of things here, is the first thing I did, and I did say, you know, as having a background in economics, I decided to start with, well, let's find the data. is it true? Was there a lot of machine? Because one of the things I didn't notice in a lot of these images was machinery. But whenever I would go to the countryside, I actually saw a lot of like old machinery, a lot of like agricultural farm machine museums, just a lot of stuff that's just like stored away. So I went, this is data from 1890. So when data is available, so from 1880s more or less to about 1940. So just that first period, I just wanted to see how much machinery was imported into Argentina from foreign places. And what I found was, of course, implements of cultivation and harvesting are the most popular, but there's like 80 categories of different types of machines and tools that came into Argentina. So this is just a little snapshot, just to give you an idea. So in this nearly 40 some odd year period, you have over 2 million plows, nearly 500,000 sour and seed drills on wheels. But a lot of this is very sophisticated machinery. A lot of this is also coming from the United States. And as I said, as I'll tell you in a minute, also, the United States also, some of the companies also settled in Buenos Aires because they realized they had a very huge market there. So more of that wheat harvesters, mechanical and manual. So this is just the number of machines that were imported during this time period. Reapers, grass mowers, and wheat threshers of all kinds. They also imported tractors, but pretty much everything. And then this is when I came, so as I'm going to agriculture museums, because that seems to be like the first stop, like I know the machine is here. Anywhere that I saw something that looked like a museum, I visited. And here you have San Vicente, Santa Fe. So this one, now nowadays, the lore of this playing the birthplace of the harvester is now well known. But back in, you know, the 1920s and stuff, this was still a very new thing. So in this story, this picture here that I have, it's the Senor brothers, Juan and Emilio Senor. The story goes that in the 1890s, they came to San Vicente. They had already had a background in the family as blacksmiths. And one of the things that the region really needed, because they had a lot of changarinis. Changarinis are semi-skilled, low-skilled people. And a lot of those changarinis needed work. So they would work with machinery, but it would always break. And they didn't have the blacksmithing skills. So they would come to the Senor brothers, or some other blacksmith, but the Senor were said to be the best. And the Senors over time, they're like, why? They figured it all out. They're like, we're just replacing a bunch of little parts. We just figured out how to make and exchange every single part of this machine. And so by the time you get to 1917, their first patent is in 1917. And they created this machine here, a harvester. So a harvester that's specific for the Argentine farm fields or the Santa Fe farm fields. And what makes the Santa Fe farm fields kind of a little bit more difficult than others is the soil is very rich. They have lots of topsoil, like feet and feet of it. But one thing about it is it's very wet and sticky and very hard to like break. So you needed like a specialized machine just for Santa Fe. And that's what the Senor brothers supplied. And they're, so this is a picture of, I think in 1921 when they sold their first machine. So their first patent was in 1917, but when they actually got the factory set up and were able to build more than just one, then they took this picture. So this is celebrating that day. And you can see here there's an order as well of man on machine. And I will say that up to this point, I have seen hundreds of these types of machines. Every time there's a new machine, there's a new picture. So here you have the brothers, the workers here at the bottom, and of course the priest, because they're going to bless this because this is a blessed event, right? And I think somewhere around here is also the Bofelli. The Bofelli family is the one who bought this first machine, but it was a major celebratory day. So with the harvester, just this machinery that came in, that was in this region. This is just like different things. I know that a lot of the farmers had machines, they wanted machines, and would access the machine somehow. This is just from a couple magazines and posters that I found. The Ransom, Sims and Jeffries is a British company, and I actually had to go to the Museum of English Rural Life to find these posters because they were posters specifically for the Argentine market, because the British, this company in particular, understood how important that market was because of all the purchases that Argentina was making. The company McCormick, this is the International Harvester Company, very famously known in the 20th century in the United States because of all, I guess the reaper from McCormick, essentially. But McCormick decided in about 1910 or so that it was time to just, instead of going through a company, through Buenos Aires or any of these other places, they actually settled in Buenos Aires. Let me see. So I'm gonna check my time really quick. I'll wrap it up really quick. So this one here, I just wanted to show you that here you have the McCormick in collaboration with local farmers and stuff to build exactly what they needed for the Santa Fe soil. So you can see over here, it's a different kind of plow tractor. It has 4 because it was meant to really break into that soil. So it's just a sign of all that collaboration. Along with this then, the domestic harvester companies, and them, I followed several companies, but I'm focusing on the Sonor because I got to meet the Sonor family and they shared with me a lot of materials, including all their patents from the period of 1917 through 1960. And so these are pictures of some of the patents. Over time, just as farming became more intensive over time, so did their machine. So this is like the one history a lot of people don't know. They know locally, everybody knows locally that there was domestic harvester companies. But I think it's one of those like stories that didn't really make the international, didn't really go outside of a lot of these regions. So this is just to show you the advancement over time. And just in conclusion, and as I said, I welcome all comments and questions as this is work that is still in process. The agriculture and technology machinery became integrated with everyday life, everyday family life, and farmer life. The way a lot of people spoke was that there was a physical and moral being to the machines themselves. Sometimes slipping into, I'm also do history of technology, so concepts of moral technology, meaning that people were creating the machines or being part of this machine culture because that was for the greater good. The greater good, whether it was for the globe or for locally, but it was for the greater good. They thought they were really doing something good for everyone, the community and the world. The other thing too, the way the machine is spoken of, la máquina, is like they are embodied within the machine, but the machine also embodies them. In some ways, it also became a trope of its own by, at least when I discovered, by the late 20th century. It also becomes a part of the community identity. And just to end on just one last thing, the Festival of the Harvester, the 1960s. So this is the peak of the machine era in Argentina. And the festival took place in San Vicente. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that you guys will be able to see this. So let me see. Can you see it? Alberto, can you see the, here, I'll do this.
No, I think it went into a different window.
Okay, so I'll do that. Can you see that now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right, so just this is just like 20 seconds and then I'll end on this one. The Grand Festival. The priest, this is very important. The people that came from all around. Move it a little bit forward. Okay, and then the famous scene of Frondizi stepping out of the car. There he is. There's President Frondizi stepping out of the car and coming to see the festival. And what is he watching? He's watching, along with this audience. Oops. Come on. The machines. There they are. So at the Fiesta de la Cosechadora, I think 23 or 24 companies actually displayed their machines. This is the Sonor machine right there, the J24. And then there was also a Queens, the Queens of the Harvesters, because the machine, remember, is male, but everything outside of that is female. Okay. All right. right, so I'll end there. And I apologize for going a little bit over, but thank you so much.